It's really easy to expose your API keys. Here are a few ways. You can put it right in your front-end code. You could encrypt it and put it in your front-end code with the encryption key also in your front-end code. You could commit it to GitHub in a public repo. You could tweet it, or you could even make it your domain name. So I see this sort of thing come up a lot. People wondering, how can I make my API keys, my secrets, whatever, secure when my front end needs to access them? The short answer is, if your client-side code needs your API key, there's no secure way to do it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no way to do it. It's just, you can't. If it's in your front-end code, someone smart enough can figure it out. A few things I want to get out of the way before diving into this. Not all API keys are meant to be secret. There's a lot of services that have a public key and usually a secret to go along with it. And the public key or client ID, they are meant to be used in your client side. There are a few ways to prevent your key from being used outside of its normal use case. For instance, you can whitelist your app bundle IDs to only allow that API key to be used. Or in a web application, you can whitelist certain domains that can use it. But ultimately, there are ways to get around this. For instance, in the latter example, I could just make a host file on my computer, set up sort of a fake SSL certificate, and point whatever domain it's whitelisted to use and run that code just on my own machine on that domain. But it never actually goes to that actual place because I'm sort of intercepting it. So all that to say, there's not really a good way or possible way to do this. And even if you think your source code is unreachable, it's obfuscated, it's compiled, it's all these kinds of things, it's easy enough at the end of the day just to sniff the network packages. Even if there's an SSL certificate involved, it's easy enough to do that. So even if you think someone can't get it from your code by, reverse engineering it or whatever, network requests is super easy to just look at the headers and get what you want from there. Ultimately, you should never trust your client-side code. It's not something that's running on your machine, it's running on someone else's. And there's just no way around that. So, if an untrustworthy user gets access to something, you really have to understand that you were just actually the untrusty developer who didn't build something correctly, and now you're being taken advantage of. So you might ask, Tyler, how do I do this then? How do I get this going? And I think this is a common question, especially in the Flutter community, because it is a very, front-end focused world. People becoming developers a lot of the time for the first time, touching Dart and Flutter, and no experience necessarily in the back end. That's why I think it comes up a lot more there than other, subreddits as an example. But I'm going to, give you some tips and pointers and tell you how you should be doing this. So it's called a server. Now, also known as another computer that's running somewhere else, the server is where you have a little more safety. In fact, a lot more safety, because you completely control it. Your server code isn't going to go run on another user's device. It's going to be locked down, in your own place. Now, this video is not in scope of saying, how do we keep our servers really secure? There's a lot of good practices in that. I'm not trying to explain that now of, using SSH keys versus passwords and all these kinds of tips that maybe another video could cover. But ultimately, for the sake of this, we're going to assume secure server. You're the only one that can access it. And let's talk through this. So what you want to do is you essentially want to keep your secret keys only in the context of your server and kind of make your server act as a proxy between the client-side code and your third-party API by essentially building an API for your client to speak to. Just doing this kind of blindly isn't really the best solution. There are sort of like proxy services and stuff out there that you can use, but we run into a couple problems if you're just essentially being a proxy, meaning you're not actually doing anything, intercepting the data, or locking it down in any way. For instance, many times a secret key actually gives you a lot of power in that third-party service. Maybe something that your users, aren't supposed to even have the power to do. So as an example, something like Stripe, the secret key lets you, create new products and manage the products, change prices, like all these things. Whereas you might just want to be getting, let's say, like a list of products back. That's maybe all the client wants to use. So just by simply using a proxy and letting, your client-side code essentially go through it and hit it, you're going to still have security issues there. So to solve that, ultimately, you don't want to just forward the whole request in terms of the URL and everything. You want to create specific endpoints for the use cases that your service is going to need, and thus the client will be able to make use of. Another issue is you haven't, although you've prevented your keys from being leaked because they're never in the client-side code, it isn't preventing anyone from abusing the endpoints that you're opening up, right? Someone could just say, oh, I know about this. I know how it works because I'm sniffing the network. Sure, I don't have the API key, but I can build my own thing and hit that service and then just get all this stuff. So example, let's say like Google Places API, which, can get pricey if it was abused. If you simply were just letting anyone hit it, you're preventing the keys from going through because they're just stored on the server and it's going to talk to Google and getting the stuff back and sending it back to your client. But if someone knows and they can figure it out, if someone knows that server, your API, they could just use that for their own application or their own use to rack up a bill for you. So how do you solve that? My suggestion is your own authentication, right? So you would build auth in whatever way you want. You can use, it obviously depends on what your backend and stuff is, whether it's something like Django, just using the built-in auth there. If you're using like a Firebase function for this, you can of course use, your Firebase auth, Superbase, all those kinds of things, many options. But the idea is you have some authentication in place and you require, that user to send up their authentication information, a JWT token or whatever the case may be for that method. Then you require them to have that. So now you've kind of blocked it to at least, okay, it has to be like a user of my application that I ultimately control and I can, ban and stuff. But you probably want to take this a bit further and actually do some logging, right? So every time someone makes an API request, you save in your database, okay, this was made at this time, this is what they did, this was the user associated with it. And then you can implement something called rate limiting. Depending on what the normal use case for your application is, maybe it's only something that you want to allow this to be called once every 10 minutes or something, like whatever the case is, but you can implement that. You can basically have a check before you go to make that third-party call. Hey, has this user done anything in the last 10 minutes or the last minute or whatever your rate limiting rules are, and lock it down and send them back a request error because of rate limiting issues. It might also be helpful because someone could just go and create multiple accounts, right? And by doing that, they could find ways around this by kind of cycling through that. And if the rate limiting is based on the user, which, I think makes sense, they can get around that. So how do you block that? Two things I would do here. One is, if it's really important, have some better authentication. I would start with, at the very least, like make sure that when people sign up, they have to check their email for a code. That way you can verify they are actually the owner of that email. That being said, it's really easy to set up multiple emails, especially with Gmail. You can just add, periods at random spots and it's essentially a different email, but it all goes to the same place. So, that kind of foils that. Also, plus signs in Gmail are everything after the plus sign, including it, are ignored. Someone could just be making multiple email addresses going to the same place. So something like two-factor authentication with a phone number, super handy. It's a lot, although not impossible, it's a lot more difficult and more time consuming to have multiple phone numbers. So you use that as sort of like one of your primary unique identifiers on the user, make sure they get a code, and then like this is probably a unique person. That's what I would do. And that's what I've done in the past, just to prevent, people from making multiple accounts, ultimately to, prevent your API keys from being abused and so on and so forth. You can also implement IP address logging to sort of help with tracking these kinds of things. If you're seeing this one user or this one IP address that's essentially using a lot of things, you could, block that entire IP address. But I would be weary and want to, mention a lot of the time, especially like say you built like an enterprise application that's being used in at a company, many of your potentially unique users might all have the same IP address because they're in the same office, on the same network more or less. So you have to be careful about that too. An IP address isn't at all a unique identifier for a person. It is just really for the network, and that can work against you if it's not done properly. So yeah, that's kind of my rant on this. Really wanted to put this out here and really just hit home that you can't keep your API keys secret if your front-end code needs them. I also want to emphasize, start simple. If you're just building this as a MVP, I would go at least to the point of having your sort of like the initial pass of what I'm saying of like a proxy server and locking down specific endpoints. But you don't necessarily have to get into, all the logging and authentication and stuff right out the gate. If you start to notice that your bill is going up on your service, that's when, you might want to start locking things down. But it's important not to, over engineer things early on. You're going to build tech debt. You're probably going to throw out this code anyways, and you'll get to market later. So, keep it simple at the same time, but also keep it secure. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.